The focus of this fourth GFRAS annual meeting, as you all know, is the role of private sector and producer organizations in rural advisory services. The organizers thought, and we think, it is quite helpful in the very beginning of a topic like this to get a kind of food for thought. So we have invited a keynote speaker to present us some thoughts and deliberations that deal with an understanding of this focus of these organizations, private sector, producer organizations. How do they do? How can we conceptualize that? So I would like, as a first part of this thematic theme, to invite Dr. Regina Birner from the University of Hohenheim, Stuttgart, here in southern Germany, to give us her keynote presentation.
Dear colleagues and friends, it is really a great pleasure and an honor to be here in Berlin at this meeting and present some introductory thoughts on the role of private sector and producer organizations in rural advisory services. As Georg had said, I'm from the University of Hohenheim, which is located in Stuttgart, southern Germany, which also has a long tradition in doing research on rural advisory services. The starting point, as the organizers have pointed out, is that we don't have so much evidence yet about producer organizations and the private sector in rural advisory services. And what I would like to offer here is, after some introductory remarks, a typology of organizations, a framework for analyzing the role of producer organizations and the private sector in rural advisory services, and some reflections on their governance challenges. I would like to start with some quantitative data. The example is from India. It's a few years old. These are the findings from a nationally representative survey conducted in 2005. 50,000 farmers all over India were asked, from whom did you actually get information about new technologies during the past year? And what we do see that, of course, apart from other farmers, the private sector does play the most important role, but only in one particular form. It is input dealers typically providing advice on their products. Around 13% of farmers use them, similar to using the radio, which distributes information from both public and private sector. The typical public sector extension worker, at least up to 2005, had remained after that one of the most important sources, reaching about 6% of farmers. And then next come what we would call producer organizations, in the Indian case, cooperative societies, reaching around 4% of the farmers. Interestingly, what we would call the typical private sector consultancy service or the non-governmental organizations or also paratechnicians together reach less than 1%. So they may be very important locally, NGOs and others, but if you look at the national average, they hadn't actually reached a very large number. And that leads us to the question, why, at least in the past, have producer organizations and the private sector played such a limited role? What are the reasons? And we often hear the argument, maybe because the government provides extension services free of charge, they crowd out public sector, maybe the private sector. Maybe private sector doesn't have any incentive if advice is also available free of charge. I do not think we have much evidence in favor of this argument. In most countries, the extension agent to farmer ratio is very low. Typically, we have only one advisor for 1,000 or 2,000 rural households. Many rural farmers have no access at all. So I can't really argue that there is a crowding out taking place. However, what might be a problem is that often public sector extension services reach those farmers or prefer to work with those farmers who could actually pay for advisory services. So that might be a problem. But we also have the argument that maybe governments restrict private sector organizations or producer organizations from providing services. Maybe there are some regulations that prevent them to do more. But I think there is not much evidence in favor of this argument either. Yeah, there are not really regulations that specifically limit organizations from providing advisory services. We may have more general problems, yeah, and lack of an enabling business environment, yeah, lack of access to credit for small-scale companies that may wish to provide advisory services could be a problem. Or we often have state interference or other obstacles for producer organizations in general that cause problems, but not usually, typically, or specifically for the provision of advisory services. So then, what are the reasons for, at least in the past, the slow involvement of the private sector and what I would call third sector producer organizations in advisory services? Well, there's a lot of literature about that, and what the economists call a market failure in agricultural extension is certainly very important. And that is, to some extent, linked to the nature of agricultural advice. Yeah, some of the agricultural advice the economists call a public good. Who is willing to pay for information that is publicly available? Yeah, so that is a market failure. Or quite often it is not clear what is really the value of that advice. Will that really increase my income or well-being? If that is not clear to the farmer, his or her willingness to pay may also be limited. In this case, the economists would call that a merit good. Also, as we all know, the structure of the smallholder farm sector is not very conducive to private sector development. The transaction costs of reaching many smallholders in very remote areas are very high, especially if those farmers are not organized very well. And often smallholder farmers also have limited capacity to pay, even if they're willing to pay. They're often cash constrained and have limited capacity to pay for agricultural services at the time when they are needed. So there's a range of possible solutions, and one very important one is the public financing of advisory services that are then provided by the private sector producer associations, so some contracting out models, or the embedding of advisory services in other business transactions. To better understand these various possible solutions, I would like to offer a very brief conceptual framework which has two elements. The first element is to distinguish the different types of organizations that could provide advisory services. And my suggestion here is to distinguish three sectors, not only two, but three. A public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. Because they have very different organizational logics. They have different types of goals, and they have different types of problems that they need to solve. So classically, the public sector, that would be government, elected officials, and the administration. So typically, public sector extension would be provided by what we would call administration. And the good thing about them that they should actually be able to address these market failures. And they should actually serve the public interests. They also, since they're the government, can provide regulations that other sectors cannot do. But we all know for a very long time that they face many governance problems, bureaucracy, elite capture, corruption, absenteeism, and so on. And that is the reason why there's this interest in other sectors, in other organizations. Okay, let's look at the private sector. And among the private sector, I think we have to distinguish the companies. Yeah, I call them here agribusiness. And of course, one of their goals is to maximize profit. And this is not because they're greedy, or because they're run by bad people or anything like that, but because they work in a market economy. They work under competition. They have to maximize profit, or at least to make profit to survive. But of course, we can also expect from them to exercise corporate social responsibility. There are a lot of governance problems involved in their presence in rural areas. But they have market power more than the farmers. They may engage in lobbying for their benefit. They may bribe public officials and so on. So they have governance challenges. The farm households, they also need to earn an income to survive, but typically they have multiple goals if they're family farms. Yeah, one of their most important goals often is food security, safety, other reasons. And of course they face these governance challenges that lead to the failure of, as I just explained, many efforts of private service provision. They are cash constraints. Often they also lack political voice. And in the third sector, I think it is also useful to distinguish different types of organizations, following Norman Uphoff here. So there are the membership organizations, self-help organizations. Yeah, they have multiple goals. And one type of self-help organizations are the cooperatives. The cooperatives are defined by having a business enterprise. Yeah, they serve the interests of their members. They may also serve public goals. And of course, these organizations have governance challenges too. Often it is difficult to form them. Who would like to take the initial effort to actually create them? Who would like to take the effort to run them? Yeah, we also have problems of exclusion. Are the poorest, the most marginalized farmers, are the women actually members of them? That is one of their challenges. And quite different from them often are the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. I would consider them as a third type in this what we call the third sector. And by definition, often they do pursue public interests, such as rural development, poverty reduction, environmental goals. But they face governance challenges too. Quite often they are non-profit on paper and still for profit in reality. There's actually a continuum between them and the private sector. So each of them have their strengths and each of them have their weaknesses. And therefore, many rural advisory services try to combine them. And here is a framework on how we can combine them. And this framework distinguishes two activities, and one is who is financing the service provision on the one hand, and who is providing the service on the other hand. And all types can be involved in either providing the service or financing the service. It was actually our great teacher, Bill Rivera, who many of you may know, who has actually drawn our attention to how important it is to make this distinction, to have a framework for understanding different institutional arrangements. Now, if the public sector both provides and finances the service, so the typical public sector model, then you would have this pure type that you see here. We could have this pure private sector model, where private sector, in this case the farmers, pay for the service and private sector companies provide it. So that would be the pure private sector type. We observe that only in more advanced stages of economic development for the reasons I just discussed. And even in very advanced industrialized societies, such as the US or Germany for that matter, we typically find them alongside with a still existing public sector model. And here we have a very interesting range of institutional arrangements. These are the contracting out models. Because here the public sector is still financing the service, at least to a large extent. Farmers may pay some fees, but mostly it is paid by the public sector. But then it is contracted out, either to private sector companies or to NGOs, or it could also be contracted out to producer organizations. Yeah, and the famous Ugandan National Agricultural Advisory Services, the famous NAADS model, that I'm sure all of you know, is a typical example of this arrangement. What we also find is an arrangement where the services are actually provided by public sector extension agents, but they are paid by private sector companies or NGOs. In practice, we observe that quite often, that NGOs, because there are really no other qualified, technically qualified persons who could provide, especially rural areas, than those who are already in the public sector. And then NGOs often top up their salaries and use them. As one can argue about the value of this model, but we observe it very often in practice. Yeah, that NGOs actually use public sector extension agents to provide the service. And then we have one that is actually very interesting, I believe has a lot of potential, and I hope will be discussed here also in more detail. This is that the farmer-based organizations, or the self-organizations of the farmers, provide the service. It could then be if farmers pay a fee financed by them, or if the service is free to the members, then it would be financed by the producer organizations themselves. For example, in India, the dairy cooperative societies provide such services. That would be an example of this model. And we find some other combinations. And now the argument that I was working with Christian Davis, I did agree when we first developed this framework, is we need to find out what institutional arrangements best fit a particular situation. Because there isn't really any silver bullet. Okay, we have one more actually I would like to mention also, and this is information provided with the sale of inputs. It's very important actually. All this type of embedded services fall in this category. So private sector companies finance the service and they actually also provide it, but typically they do this because they have to earn an income, so they typically do this together with some kind of business transaction, sale of inputs or involved in some other aspects of the value chain. So this is also a very important model, private sector model, that I'm sure will be discussed in this meeting. Okay, some of the governance challenges that we have observed from past experience of these institutional arrangements. One is on the public financing of private or third sector providers. So contracting out. Here, a study by Patience Regina in Uganda, using the example of the National Agricultural Advisory Services in Uganda, said that we may have underestimated the governance challenges in this procurement in contracting. And making contracts all over the countries at the district or sub-county level is actually also a challenge. There can be political interference, there can be other kind of problems, and that doesn't mean they can't be solved. But we shouldn't underestimate them. Because in the public sector, typically we don't have this contracting issue. But it can become a problem once there's contracting out. Also, what Patience Regina found, it's very important if the public sector remains involved, how this reform process actually happens. Imposing it from outside may be a problem. There's also quite a lot of evidence on voucher-based systems. Here the idea is the government gives the farmer a voucher, so still public financing, and then with this voucher, the farmer can exercise a demand. And with the voucher, he can go to a private sector provider or to an NGO provider. So in principle, actually a very good system, but it is, and there's evidence from Chile and Costa Rica, summarized in a paper we wrote with Gershon Feder and Sean Anderson. The problem here is there are equally governance challenges in handling vouchers, because vouchers are like cash, and they can be as easily misused as cash can be misused. So it's not that the system can't work in principle, but you have to be aware that it may face this problem. It has faced these problems in practice, unfortunately. Embedded services, also huge potential. For example, advice linked to the purchase of inputs and output sales. Also in the paper with Gershon Feder, we summarize some experience from India with agri-clinics or with Mahindra machinery services. Huge potential, definitely. But one of the challenges are smallholders really included in these kind of services. Quite often they may not be so much of interest to the private sector. So certainly also a challenge here. Still, there are many promising options, and I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting discussions, information sharing about promising options. I personally believe that opportunities created by producer organizations remain far underexplored. India's dairy cooperatives, I think, a very good example of service provision by the cooperatives. And of course, there are huge opportunities created by new technologies, cell phone-based, internet-based services, may actually help to solve some of the market failures that have prevented private sector involvement in the past. e-Jupa, the internet-based services in India, the Indian Tobacco Company, are an example of new opportunities created by new technologies. Also, these embedded services, integration into contract farming, are a big opportunity. It may depend on the bargaining positions of the farmers, how much they can benefit here. And I think it's also important to talk about alternative financing options. Because in the models we have seen so far, it still remains the public sector to a large extent providing the finance. And that brought the problems we have seen, like challenges in contracting and so on. So maybe there are other models, like levies for commodity-based research and extension. Has been tried in many countries, may actually still be a valuable option. The World Bank has experimented with farmer innovation funds. So there are other options, and I think there's a lot out there that we can explore and discuss. Let me conclude with some final remarks. The observation working in this field for quite a while now is that the discussion about rural advisory services is often dominated by ideological positions, not so much by evidence. And we have all seen these ideological debates on the training and visit, on the farmer field school, on many other points. And quite often underlying these debates is a fundamental difference, different views that people hold on the role that the public sector, the private sector, or the third sector should play in the rural economy, or maybe in the economy in general. And that is linked to political positions, obviously. Typically, the political left is more interested in more state sector involvement. The political right is more interested in more private sector involvement. Green parties may be more interested in civil society involvement. And I think it is actually quite dangerous to discuss these issues along ideological lines. We're standing here in Berlin, a city that was once divided by ideological differences, exactly on that question: what should the state and what should the private sector do? And I think we have to leave that behind us. And we have to acknowledge there is no silver bullet. Each sector has its unique strengths, and each sector has its weaknesses and its challenges. And the idea is to find out what works best. If we wrote a paper moving from best practice to best fit. What best fits a particular situation? And on a personal note, I would like to conclude that I believe ultimately we do need all three sectors for rural development to happen. We need a responsive and capable public sector that at least can set the frame conditions for civil society and private sector to thrive. We need a private sector that is efficient, that is innovative, but that is also socially responsible, especially to smallholders and to women. And we need an empowered civil society. That is very important, because only the self-organization can give voice. Voice to the poor, voice to the marginalized, voice to women, and enable them to bargain on equal terms with the private sector and to hold the public sector accountable. Thank you very much.